Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complete Python Programming course. In this video, we'll talk about functions. This video is part of the beginner tutorial. If you are familiar with functions and looking for more detailed information about them, please check my intermediate level tutorials. A function is a reusable block of code. By using functions, your code becomes more organized and much more efficient. To declare a function in Python, we use def space function name, followed by parentheses and colon and statements to execute. Notice that in other languages, you would use something like function name, and you would use it this way. Functions in Python are different. You use the def keyword, and you don't have to give it any scoping or public or a private or whatever. So it's much simpler in Python. Let's see what we can do with that. Say hello is my function name, and it does one thing only: print hello to the screen. To call a function, we use the function name followed by parentheses. That's all about it. Let's run our code. Python 3 main.py, and Python printed hello to my terminal. You can call your function any number of times, and Python will just execute the function as many times as needed. This is pretty much useless function. I could just print say hello in here and it will work the same. So let's make our function a bit more functional. Say hello, and we can give our function a parameter. The parameter name is passed to the function as an argument when you call the function. James. Notice that between the parentheses, I added a name to my function, and when I called my function, I used an argument to replace the name. Let's run that. Let's use the name in our function, print name. Any parameter of the function is available to you inside the function. Let's run our code. And Python printed hello James to my screen. You can call the same function with different names, and it will be executed for each one differently. Passing one argument might not be enough. You can pass multiple arguments to your function. Let's pass first name and last name to our function, and first name and last name. James Doe and David Smith. Let's run this code. And notice that I have hello James Doe and David Smith. Let's take a second here and see what we can do with that. James Doe is the first name and last name. James is the first name, Doe is the last name. How about ignoring one of the arguments? Our function expects or is defined with two parameters, and I am calling it with one argument only to replace fname. Let's try to run that and see what Python says. And type error, hello, say hello, missing one required positional argument, lname. It took James and put it in fname, and then it didn't have another argument for lname, which reported an error. So you always have to call your function with the same number of argument it's defined with. You can define your function with as many parameters as you want, but you have to call it with the same number of arguments as the parameters. This function just prints name to the screen, and we can do it in a different way. Let's talk about the function return statement. Let's go with a different function, def add numbers, parentheses a and b. I have a function that would add numbers together, and it takes two arguments, a and b, and this function job will be adding these numbers together. Result equals a plus b. And I would like to return this result to the caller. Notice that here I just created a result variable. Let's see how we call that. Add numbers 10 and 5. If we run this code, we will see absolutely nothing on our screen. We call the function, but the function just creates a variable called result, and it's not doing anything with it. The return statement allows you to return something to your caller. Let's try that. Result. Notice return result. Let's see how that works. C equals add numbers and print C. Let's run this code and see how it works. Notice that C is 15. What happened in here? I have a function called add numbers, and it returns the result of adding two numbers together. When I call the function, I ask Python to get the result from my function, whatever returned in the return statement, and add it or assign it to the variable C. And then I printed C. That is straightforward. You can do that the same. You can just go with D equals add numbers, and you can use it with two different numbers, and that will work as expected. Print D, and we run our code, and Python will run the two functions and return the two results to our variables. Python allows us to do something more. Notice that my function takes A and B. When I call my function to make my code more readable, I could do something like that. Instead of calling my function by the position of the parameter as an argument, these are called, when we called our function this way, this is called positional arguments, because every argument is matching the position of each parameter. It's called positional arguments. We can turn them into something we call keyword parameters or keyword arguments in this case. The keyword argument is when you pass the name of the parameter to the function with its argument. This way makes the code much more readable. If we run that, Python will run our function without any problems, and you will get the exact same result. Using this way allows you to change the position of the argument. They are keywords. Python care about the keywords of the argument. So you can do B here and A here, and that will work the same. Now the value of A, let's print that. Print A and print B. A, and let's add B to see which argument is which. Now when we run our function the first time without A and B in here, run our code, and A is 10, B is 5. By adding A here and B before the 5, it's still exactly the same. A is 10 and 5, and B is 5. Now, if I switch these, now the values are a little different. A is 5 and B equal 10. You usually don't need to do that, but you know that you have an option to pass the arguments using keywords without caring about the position. Let's take a different function and introduce one more concept. Diff greet, and it takes a name of the person to greet. Print hello name. If we call our function, we call it using greet and date. We run our code and it prints hello David. If we run it with any other name, it will do the same. Now here you can pass name equals David and it will work exactly like the previous example. There is another concept here called default arguments, which allows you to assign a default argument to your variable or to your parameter. Name equals body. Let's try to see how that works. I'm calling my function with the argument David, and my function will run and print hello David to my screen. I will call my function again, but without an argument. Notice that we say that the function should have the same number of arguments as the parameters. If I run this code, it will run correctly, but it will print hello buddy instead of David. What happens in there? I asked Python that if the function is called without this parameter, use buddy as an alternative. You can see situations like that in code all the time. Let's do a little bit more change. If name equals John and lname equals Doe. Notice that I have a function that takes two arguments and I have default arguments for both values. So if name here and lname. If I call this function with a name, David Smith, it will print hello David Smith. Now, both parameters have default arguments. Let's call it without Smith. Or let's keep that. Greet, so we can see it on the screen. James Jones. Now, if we call it this way, it will print David Smith and James Jones. Let's remove Jones from this and try to call our function. Run our code, and it replaced the last name with the default argument because it doesn't have a last name. So, hello James Doe. Let's call it now without any name, greet, and run our code. And notice that it replaced both parameters with the default arguments. I hope that's clear enough. You can call your function with the default parameters or default arguments when you want. Let's see something here. Notice that if name doesn't have a default argument, but lname has a default argument. Let's run this exact code here and see what happens. Clear and run our code. And hello David Smith, it has both, it used them. Hello James, it used James and replaced Doe. Let's call it without arguments at all. Greet and run our code. and Python returned an error. Greet missing one required positional argument if name. You need to call it. The arguments that has no defaults should be supplied to the function. Let's see one more example about that. Let's have a default argument for the first name, but we have no default argument for the last name. Let's run our code with these two examples. And none of my examples ran. Python stopped here actually, it didn't reach my function. What's the error? Non-default argument follows default argument. If you need to supply default arguments to your function, they should be at the end of the function parameters. You cannot follow an argument that has default value with a parameter that has a default value. Always put them at the end. This will not work, but if you add it to the last name, it will work as expected. This should run correctly. Let's see one more example of how the functions work. Greet full name. I am passing full name to the function, and I will call my function with a list of arguments. Let's make it like name equals and a list of names. James Smith. I have a list and it has the first name and last name as its own arguments. And I could pass these to my function name. Notice that name is a list, so in this case I could use full name and full name and 1 and 0. Now what happens in here? I'm just passing a list to my function. So full name is a list. Full name is a list and you can access its values the same as we learned in the previous lessons with 0 and 1 by index. This should run correctly without any problems. Let's run our code. And it printed James Smith. Now, notice what I can do here. If I don't have this list and I want to call my function, there is no need to create a list. I could say James and Smith. Notice it's not a list now, but my function expects a list. We can change that behavior by adding a star here, passing arguments to the function. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's run that and see why it runs. Run our code and it ran correctly. What happens in here? The function greet has a star. We are instructing Python to expect a list here. Actually, it's a tuple in this case. So what happens when Python finds the greet and it has arguments, it will create a tuple from the arguments. Let's see that. Print full name. And let's print only the type of that. Actually, we don't need to see its value. We know what its value is. And notice that full name is a tuple. And this is how you actually create tuple usually, but Python didn't take these as independent arguments because of the star. It took it as a tuple, and Python passed the tuple to your function. That's very useful in functions. Using this method, you can pass an arbitrary number of arguments to your function. So here you could pass as many names as you want. Let's change our function to greet people. And here you could change it to names. And after that, you could go for name in names. Print hello name. Notice that it will greet as many people as you want. In this case, I'm passing James and Smith, and that will be converted to a tuple. And if we run that, greet people. Let's just change the function name here. And we run our code. And it will print, hello James, hello Smith. You can pass as many names as you want. Lisa, Carol, and Thomas. And it will greet them all. Exactly the same. This is the way you pass arbitrary number of arguments to your function. This can be very useful when you are working with other systems. So you can define your function using arbitrary number of arguments, and Python will take all the arguments, convert them into a tuple, and pass it to your function. Notice what will happen if I call my function without any values. And Python started, and Python returned without doing anything because an empty tuple, and Python knows that you don't need to loop it, so you can call it even without arguments. Let's see one more thing about functions. Let's use the function greet again. And this function will greet one person, name. I will print hello name. Let's remove that. And in this case, I would like to take the name as multiple arguments. In other words, I would like to treat name as a dictionary. So name, if name, and name, L name. How do I call something like that? Of course, you would create, it looks like a dictionary keys. So let's create a dictionary, person equals a dictionary which has if name equals James and L name equals Smith. To pass person to my function, I would go person, and this will actually run correctly without any problems. We are just passing a dictionary to our function. If we print that, print name, let's print the type of name, and we run our code, and it's a dictionary because I pass a dictionary to my function. There is another way of using this. If you don't already have the dictionary, you can just use it this way. If name equals James and L name equals Smith. Now, if you run this code, you will get an error. This function expects one argument and you are passing two arguments. Let's try that. And Python will complain, greet got an expected keyword argument if name. You can solve this issue by passing 2 stars in here. Let's run that and see if it runs. And Python ran my code correctly. When the function has 2 stars, we call these keyword arguments. Notice that with 1 star, it's an argument. Arguments, here it's keyword arguments. When Python sees that, it takes all the keyword arguments and convert them into a dictionary. And notice that the type of name is a dictionary. Let's mix these 2 examples together to see how that goes. Args, and I will make this a star. And let's also add name. Now notice this is a collection of all the things we saw so far. I have a function called greet name. It takes args with 1 star and it takes kwargs. It's very good to use these words, args and kwargs. You see them in programs all the time, and it's some kind of a standard to call them args because they are arguments, and when they have keywords, you call them kwargs, keyword arguments. Now let's see how Python handles that. print name, print args, and print kwargs. Let me change these names to make it easier for explanation. Let me make these, for this example, pets and friends. And here we have pets, and here we have friends. Let's call this function. You have to work your way slowly and see how it works. The first parameter of this function is name. You can add your name as an argument. The second one is arguments, arbitrary argument. So you can add your pets like this. Dog, it's arbitrary number. You can add as many of these as you want. Dog, cat, and a horse. Now, the last is friends, and it's a keyword argument. Let's add them using keywords. John equals, let's go with phone numbers or email or something like that. Let's assume it's a phone number. And Lisa, and let's assume also it's a phone number. Let's run this, see how it goes, and we come back to our code. This is Lisa without this. Let's run that and see how it goes. And we run our program and notice what happened. James was added in a place of name. For pets, it's arguments, and Python took every argument that doesn't have a keyword and created a tuple out of them. Dog, cat, horse. When Python found the first keyword argument, it created these as a dictionary, where the key is that keyword and the value is the argument you passed for that keyword. Notice we have John 0 and Lisa 1. As a beginner, you don't have to worry too much about these. I just wanted to include them just in case somebody is looking for a way of how to use these. But for a beginner, you will see them in examples. You will get used to them as we move along in this course. This is a beginner tutorial. I don't want to go into complex things. So I would like to just explain one more thing about function before ending this lesson. Def func. I have a function that does one thing. It prints a value of a, and it has a equals local. I'm going to call my a equals local. And I will call my function func just like that, and I will run my code. This function does one thing, and it's printing the value of a variable which is inside it. And my function returned local. I would like to do one more thing and create a variable here. I call it a equals global. Now notice that I have a variable called global inside the function. Python sees that now it has a variable called global. Then I run my function. Python sees that I have a variable called local, and it's called also a. Let's run that and see what happens. Clear. And we run our code, and Python said local. That would be expected. Python starts from here, then go to the function, then it found that a became local, and it printed it. Let's print a after running the function. Let's run that. And a, after running the function, became global. What's happening in there? Let's see how we can explain that. A function has its own scope. The scope of the function is everything inside the function. The local, we call it I use the word local and global on purpose. We call it the local scope because it is local to the function. This is the global scope because it's all our variables. Now let me delete the a inside the function, or let me explain what happened in here again. Function ran and it has a inside it. Outside the function, a is the a from the global scope, not from inside the function. The variables inside the functions are local to the functions and shouldn't be accessed from outside the function. Let me delete this a and see what Python does in this case. The func doesn't have an a variable, and it ran, but it ran as global. Why it returned global from inside the function in the first case here? Because it is the function can actually access the global scope to find the variable. What happens in here if we have a equals local? Python will take that a, because what Python does once you run your function, when you call your function, Python, when it finds this variable, it will search the local scope of the function. There is no a. If there is an a in the local scope, it will take it and put it in the print statement and it will print local. If there is no a, Python will go and search. Let's run that again so we can see it. And this is what happened in this case. Python found local in the a in the local scope, so it printed it. Now, if we remove that a, Python will leave the local scope of the function and go print global from, or the value of a from the global scope. Let's take just one more step in that. Let's a equals local, and let's remove this one. You know how Python run the code, it reads this, but it does nothing. And then when it reads this, it goes execute the function, then continues. Let's see what happens when we run this code. And run our code. And the first thing that happened, Python printed local. It ran the function and found that a equals local. And it printed it. After that, it arrived at this print statement. Tried to find a. It didn't find it because outside the function, a is undefined. A is not defined. So it has no access to our variable called a. Function can access the global scope when it doesn't find the variable inside it, but outside the function, it cannot go inside the function because once this call is finished, the function is done. Its variables are destroyed. I hope that's clear enough. We'll see more examples of that. Don't worry too much if you don't get it. We will see examples and you will see why we do it that way. I don't want to make this lesson any longer. Try to create some functions, try to work with them and see if you get any errors. Try this global and local scope. You have to try them as many times as possible. Try it with different variables. Try everything we talked about today. You will get used to it eventually. And it doesn't take that much time, trust me. If you like my videos, support the channel by subscribing. Until next time, have a great time.